In this audio, I'll discuss briefly about the biographical assessment of William Wordsworth's life, what all the contemporary and modern day critics opined about him, how they assessed his life, the estimation of his poetic persona through the personal prism. So, Wordsworth was born in the year 1770 and he was a son of a lawyer and a land agent. He was known throughout his life, post his life, posthumously, as an iconoclast. Iconoclast because he inaugurated a new poetic idiom that had sought to invigorate the world of poetry through a worldview which was completely different, which was radically different from the poetics of the preceding age. He studied at Cambridge, and it was during his studies and his college at Cambridge that he went on vacation with friends to France, where he stayed for a year. And like so many of his generation, he was quite enthusiastic about the French Revolution. In 1797 and in 1798, he lived in close association with Coleridge, and as a result of this friendship was the lyrical ballads. Although the rest of his long life was uneventful, but he was known for his travels and the publication that he made during the intervals of his works. He traveled to Wales, to Scotland, to Ireland, and to many other continents. While he was publishing his work, he was not received very well with the public, and in fact he was long neglected by the same public and abused by the critics. And if you remember, we also talked about Francis Jeffrey, how in one of the important newspapers and in different pamphlets, Francis Jeffrey has openly abused, condemned Wordsworth and his way of writing. His poetic credo was openly met with contempt by Francis Jeffrey, especially in Edinburgh Review. But ultimately, in 1843, that is just 7 years before his death, he was appointed as a poet laureate, and he was appointed as a poet laureate in succession to Robert Southey. And it was only during his closing years of his life that he was universally acclaimed. He was universally esteemed. He was given this grand epithet that he belonged to that grand old man generation of English letters. Now, in the past, critics have emphatically designated Wordsworth, they have emphatically labeled Wordsworth as one of the greatest nature poet of England, which is even true to an extent. But before Wordsworth, William Cowper, Robert Burns, William Blake, they were, and of course other contemporaries of William Wordsworth such as Byron, Shelley, Keats, they were all great lovers of nature. So what was it that made Wordsworth as to be the different one, or as to have some distinction from these other poets? The difference was, to him, that is to Wordsworth, nature was not just a mere physical lovely object. To him, nature was not just mere a physical loveliness, but a revelation of God. He worshipped nature because he saw that in all natural objects and in all natural things, the indwelling spirit of the Supreme Being pervaded. To him, the myriad forms and phenomena around the world, they were nothing but various manifestations of that divine. And it won't be an exaggeration to regard him as a mystic. And in fact, many of the modern day critics have regarded him as a mystic. But there was much more to his poetic persona than just being a mystic. It is true that for him, to love nature was to love man, who is also again a part and parcel of nature. And to love one's fellows became a cardinal principle of Wordsworth philosophy. And of course, it gave him a very profound human significance. But apart from all these, it was William Wordsworth who, in his quiet contemplation, found nature to be a great teacher and a great healer. In one of his poems, one of the excerpts says that, and I quote, "One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can." So it was Wordsworth's conviction that by laying oneself open to the influences of nature, a person acquires not only the wisdom, health, beauty, and grace of body, but also the calm of mind. So for him, nature restored in him the faith in divine providence. And in times of crisis, that was the only sure support of a man which he can have amid all the other external trials and tribulations of life. Now, Wordsworth believed that sensing these healing qualities or healing properties of nature, or being mystical or spiritual with nature, is not just a one day task. Rather, he believed that there were 3 stages in the development of this, and he described this in these stages in one of his poems in, say, Tintinabe. And of course, there's another one, the description can be found in Immortality Ode. Now, what he says that in the first stage, his love of nature was like that of a child, sheer animal delight in the freshness and beauty of natural objects. That is, when nature and its objects appeal to you in the most basic form, the primordial form. And the next stage then comes that is the second stage. This will be like when a young man has a kind of passion and love for his beloved. That is, when an impassioned love, like a young man's passion for his beloved, exists. And he says this in these lines, quote unquote, "The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion." Right? So the second stage was that of a young man having a passion for his beloved. The same is the kind of love is expected towards nature. The third stage was reached when these aching joys or these pains that a lover feels and these dizzy raptures of the youth, they yielded place to a quieter and more sober mood in which he becomes aware with the spiritual and human significance of God. Ultimately, it was in the third stage that he saw that nature was ultimately the abode of God. So to sum up, Wordsworth owed his distinctive position in English literature to his spiritual interpretation of nature. No other poet made nature his exclusive concern as Wordsworth did to nature. To Wordsworth, nature was all in all. It was his religion. In fact, he had no other religion except for nature. He was not Christian in the ordinary sense, in the common sense. Rather, he saw that element of Christianity. He saw that element of religion in woods, in mountains, in meadows, in any living spirit. So that's why critics have also regarded him as a kind of pantheist, someone who believes in the universal spirit which permeates the whole universe. And that's also the reason why he's been called a mystic. In this audio, we're going to begin with the textual reading of the Preface to Lyrical Ballads, 1800. But before starting with the textual reading, let's have some idea about what and how it originated and what was its relevance in the first place. So the first edition of the publication of lyrical ballads was done jointly with Coleridge. Wordsworth did jointly with Coleridge in 1798. He got it published jointly with Coleridge in 1798. And initially itself, that is in 1798, he prefixed it as a kind of advertisement. Why advertisement? Because he said, and he asserted and he wrote it up, that the majority of poems that were written in it, they were to be considered as experiments to know, to determine, to find out, quote unquote, how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of society is adapted to the purposes of poetic pleasure. So you'll find this mention of the same in one of the PPTs as well, that initially he prefixed this 1798 lyrical ballads as advertisement, which was to be seen more as an experiment to know how far this language, this conversational colloquial language fares, that is the language of the middle people, of the lower classes, if it is adapted for the purpose of poetic pleasure, how far it will fare to ultimately give the artistic pleasure or to give that aesthetic pleasure. In the second 2-volume edition of 1800, that is the preface of which we are going to start with today, Wordsworth said, of course, with his frequent conversations with Coleridge, he said that this advertisement has been expanded into a preface now, and this is nothing but the justifications that these poems are not used or are not published as experiments, but now they exemplify the preface as well as these poems in the lyrical ballads. They now exemplify the principles of all good poetry. So here he's establishing himself that this is not a kind of experiment I'm trying to establish or giving some sort of justification. It is more like I'm deliberately giving a principle of, not just one principle, the principles of what stands as good poetry. Though 2 years later, this same preface in 1800 was enlarged for the third edition of Lyrical Ballads, and it was published in 1802. So finally, it came down to 3 publications. One is in 1798, another one in 1800, and third one in 1802. And the one which we are going to read will be the 1800 preface to Lyrical Ballads. Now, among the modern literary canons, Wordsworth preface is regarded as, or it has been given the reputation of a revolutionary manifesto about the nature of poetry. And how well it was received or how badly it was received, though, as I mentioned earlier too, the critics did not favor it initially, but later on, maybe during the time of Victorian poetry or Victorian critics, for example, they found it and they clubbed it under the umbrella term called romantics. And of course, they started to find the beauty behind finally the credo behind this kind of poetry. And William Hazlitt, to tell you, in one of the lectures in 1818, he declares a kind of overall analysis of the Lake School of Poetry, whose head was William Wordsworth. He says that this poetry of Lake School, of which William Wordsworth was as its authority, as its top notch, this must be seen as a literary equivalent of the French Revolution. That is, the poetry of Lake School, of which Mr. Wordsworth was as its head, is to be seen as a literary equivalent to that of French Revolution. Why? Because it was more like a translation of political change into poetical or literary experiments. Now, the kings and queens were dethroned from their rank and station in some sort of legitimate tragedy or epic poetry, and the paradox that these poets set out, these poets, the Lake poets, William Wordsworth, Blake, the paradox that these poets set out was that all things are by nature equally fit subjects for poetry, or that if there is any preference that is to be given, then it should be given to the most humble men. That preference should be given to the most meanest. Meanest here, not in the sense how we take the modern day coinage of the term mean. It is in the sense of being humble, poor, and the most uncompromising. So he says that what Lake School poets have done is that they have taken the subjects of serious poems from the lives of humble people, from the lives of humble country folk, and because of this, they have tried to elicit a genteel audience's sympathies for these disgraced souls, for these outcasts, for these delinquent people, that may include convicts, prisoners, female vagrants, gypsies, mad mothers, idiot boys, right? So they become the subject, the poetic subject of these New Age poets. New Age poets, that is the Lake School of Poets. And in fact, as a modern day reader of Wordsworth's poetry or Wordsworth's preface, I won't be exaggerating, or it won't be an overstatement if I say that it is because of this preface that the pulp fiction, the pulp literature got its significance, and the preface was no less significant in establishing the importance of pulp fiction or pulp literature in general. And that's also the reason why this preface is regarded as a turning point in English criticism, English literary criticism, and also a very central document in modern cultures too. So, without any further ado, let's start with the reading of the preface. And I've already forwarded you the text that is in the last week. You all can access it and take out the first page, that is the first and half. So I don't know whether you have taken the printouts or you're reading it online. If you're reading it online, let me simply name out or call out the paragraph, and then we'll begin with it. So I'm on the fourth paragraph, which begins with several of my friends are anxious for the success of these poems. Why I'm beginning with this one? Because we've already taken into account the first two paragraphs, that is more about just the introduction, why he published it or for whom he was publishing it. So let's just straightforward jump to the fourth paragraph, that is, several of my friends are anxious for the success. The paragraph begins with this. So let me begin with the reading, and I'm quoting from the text now. Several of my friends are anxious for the success of these poems from a belief that if the views with which they were composed were indeed realized, a new class of poetry would be produced, well adapted to interest mankind permanently and not unimportant in the multiplicity and in the quality of its moral relations. And on this account, they have advised me to prefix a systematic defense of the theory upon which the poems were written. So what were the reasons, what were the intentions, what was the objectives of William Wordsworth, why he attached this formal piece of theory, or why he attached this formal piece called preface before the lyrical ballads, before his poetic collection of lyrical ballads? So the first objective was that he wanted to give a systematic defense, a systematic justification, a systematic explanation of his point of view, of his standpoint, by providing in detail a theoretical framework behind his composition of poems. And why was there a need to attach this theoretical framework in the first place? It was needed primarily because whenever a new poet intends to, or a new poet struggles to carve a niche for himself, he is ideally expected to present, to give an overview of the theoretical moorings, an overview of that theoretical scaffolding upon which he is composing his artistic work. And what is scaffolding? I use the word theoretical scaffolding. The poet must attach a theoretical scaffolding upon which the poet has composed his artistic pieces if he's trying to explore, or if he's trying to come up with a new dimension, with a new poetic innovation that he has brought out in his poetry. Yes, it is needed. What is scaffolding? Scaffolding, if you've noticed, these are metal poles, wooden boards that are formed when we see a building is getting made. So these are very fundamental units of any building. When you're trying to make a building, how a building is supposed to, before cementing it, you make it stand on the basis of or upon the metal poles and wooden boards. So that becomes a scaffolding upon which the building in future is supposed to be constructed. Similarly, if the poet intends to come up with his artistic work, on what theoretical grounds is he composing it? That becomes important if they are introducing any new poetic innovation. That becomes important if they are bringing up a new dimensional poetic technicality through their work, right? And through this prefatory argument, Wordsworth, in a way, is giving us a peep, a glimpse of his perspective on arts and on poetic composition, his cognitive frame for poetic creation, right? Now let's reread these lines. I quote, and I'm quoting from the text. Several of my friends are anxious for the success of these poems from the belief that if the views with which they were composed, that is, if the theoretical moorings that I'm going to present were realized, and if these theoretical moorings becomes understandable to the critics and to the masses and to the general public, and it is understood, comprehended well, and the people get interested in it as well. If it gets realized, a new class of poetry would be produced, and that is something self-explanatory, that is something true. Even after this, a new class of poetry emerged, that is entirely a new ideological underpinning of poetry, of a poetic school started to emerge, that is the Romantic school of poetry. If the views with which they were composed were indeed realized, a class of poetry would be produced, well adapted to interest mankind permanently. And this was something why first of all, or in the first place, this man was called an iconoclast, because of course he broke away from the established rules of neoclassicism, so and so forth. Second, the kind of theoretical scaffolding that he was giving, the kind of theoretical framework that he was trying to establish, if it gets comprehended well in the audience, among the audience, with the critics and with the public as well, this will be a kind of forever and eternal new class of poetry that can never ever be negated, and that will eventually be revived and realized in later stages as well. For example, if you view today, most of the modern poetry in English, it is written in blank verse. It is free of all metrical composition, metrical rules and regulations. And yes, it is also conveyed in the most simplest of language. The poetic subject is again the common folks, common people like you and I, right? So this is something, the Romantic poetry has certainly changed the course of the poetics that were written in the modern age, and it changed it forever. Let's reread it. Several of my friends are anxious for the success of these poems from a belief that if the views with which they were composed were indeed realized, a new class of poetry would be produced, well adapted to interest mankind permanently, and not unimportant in its multiplicity and in the equality of its moral relations. And on this account, they have advised me to give a prefix, a systematic defense of the theory upon which the poems were written. Now let's move on. Let's leave the rest of the part of this paragraph. It is not relevant. Let's move on to the next paragraph. That is, it is supposed that. Now I begin with the reading. It is supposed that by the act of writing in verse, an author makes a formal engagement that he will gratify certain known habits of association, that he not only thus apprises the reader that certain classes of ideas and expressions will be found in his book, but that others will be carefully excluded. Now here he simply mentions that the moment a poet, a writer indulges in an act of writing, or a verse writer indulges in the act of writing, he is in a way making a formal engagement of what? A formal engagement with the reader about his own ideas and expressions. These ideas and expressions, what he is going to include and what he is going to exclude. So the ideas and expressions which are not mentioned, clearly the author does not subside, or the author does not in a way establishes any relation to all those excluded ideas and expression. For example, the simple example, all I talk of in my poetry or in a simple paragraph writing is of the color black. When I'm only talking about color black and not any other color, that means my ideas and expressions are deliberately in relation to a particular color only. and the fact that I'm excluding the rest of the colors, that is, I'm not talking about white, I'm not talking about red, I'm not talking about blue, I'm not talking about green, so on and so forth. That means these ideas of colors are deliberately excluded, right? So the moment an author engages in this verse activity, he or she establishes a formal engagement with his known habits of association, and he apprises the reader, he lets the reader know that certain classes of ideas and expression will be included, and all others which are not included, they are deliberately excluded, right? Now let's continue with the reading. This will be found in his book, but that others will be carefully excluded. This exponent or symbol, again I'm continuing from the text. This exponent or symbol held forth by metrical language must in different eras of literature have excited very different expectations. For example, in the age of Catullus, Terence and Lucretius, and that of Statius or Claudian, and in our own country in the age of Shakespeare, Beaumont and Fletcher, and that of Donne, Cooley or Dryden and Pope. Now he's simply taking an example of the thing he just now talked of. That is, he said when a poet is indulging in a verse activity, and when he's indulging in this poetic formal engagement with the reader, he's including certain class of ideas and expression and excluding the other. And he's taking the same statement into account, and with the help of an example, he's explaining it. And what's the example? That if you find the works of these ancient Roman poets, that is Catullus, Terence and Lucretius. Now the first three category of these Roman poets, they all were known for their naturalness and simplicity. And the remaining two, that is Statius and Claudian, they both, that is these two Roman poets were known for their elaborate artifice, for their artificiality of style, for their ornamental expression. Right? Similarly, he takes the example of our age, that is our age in his own country, in his own time, that is of Shakespeare and Beaumont and Fletcher, and that of John Donne, Cooley and Dryden and Pope. Now Dryden and Pope were very different from John Donne and Cooley. How? John Donne and Cooley were writing in metaphysical conceits, were using the metaphysical conceits, and Dryden and Pope were using the neoclassical idiom. The latter one, that is of Dryden and Pope, was very, very artificial, was in a way glitzy, was in a way pretentious to an extent. And the previous one by John Donne and Cooley, it was primarily an intellectual, a work upon someone's intellectual ingenuous, right? Conceit. What is conceit? The idea of innovation plus intellectual ingenuity is a conceit, right? So he says that if something is carefully excluded, so if John Dryden and Pope decided to exclude all simplicity, all naturalness, it was done deliberately. Why? Because they were representing their own class of ideas and expressions. And on the contrary, and similarly, John Donne and Cooley, they were representing their own class of ideas and expressions by using, for example, the metaphysical conceit.